Whether you're looking for high fantasy adventures to modern day mysteries, all the way to sinister space horrors, Dungeons & Dragons could be so many different things. But there are a lot of TTRPGs out there. So is it the one that you should be playing? Let's jump into the history of Dungeons & Dragons, how it's played, and what it could be to see if it's the right role-playing game for you. But first, let me get more into theme. Oh, there we go. Much better. Alright, so we're going to jump into the history of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, D&D has been around for about 50 years at this point in time, so there's a lot of history, but I tried to truncate it as much as I can. Starting off with the beginning, Dungeons & Dragons was published in 1974 by a company called TSR, and it was originally created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, based off of a system that Gygax created earlier on in the 70s called Chainmail. The idea behind the game was to create a battle simulator, but instead of playing as an entire army, you'd play as one character and you could personalize that character however you wanted. It took a lot of inspiration from the books that Gygax and Arneson read when they were younger, most notably being the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. When it was initially released, it was essentially 3 pamphlets that told you how to utilize multiple different systems throughout the game to play it, along with multiple dice. Some of the dice that were included were the D20, the D12, the D8, the D6, and the D4. The D10 was not added until later in the lifespan of the game. In that initial release, there were 4 races you could play as: humans, elves, dwarves, and hobbits. For anybody who has any familiarity with the game currently, you'll notice that hobbits are not in the game. But what bears most striking resemblance to them are halflings. That was due to a lawsuit by the Tolkien estate, and so multiple things in the game had to change, such as hobbits became halflings, the Balrog became the Baelor, and Ents became treants. With an extremely small budget to start out, and not a lot of belief in them honestly, they were highly successful in their first year, selling about 1,000 copies. And then in their second year, they sold about 3,000 copies, their main demographic being high school students and college students. In 1974, they decided to have a more official re-release of the game, where they utilized the systems in the books itself, but people wanted more. Because initially in the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons, you could go up to level 3, and later in the time in the basic set, you could go up to level 5. But people wanted more progression and more options. Therefore, in 1977, they created the 2-pronged approach, which they would keep on publishing the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons just so that you could gain a familiarity with the system and go up to level 5. But if you wanted to go further and get more rules and more options, then you would play Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or AD&D. AD&D brought so many more things to the table that people were looking for, one of which being the extended classes you could play as. In the initial set of Dungeons & Dragons, you could play as the Fighting Man, the Magic User, or the Cleric. But in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they added classes like Monk, Paladin, Druid, Thief, and Assassin. If you also have familiarity with the game, you'll notice that they merged Thief and Assassin eventually into the Rogue class, but that is not until way further on. Throughout the 80s, Dungeons & Dragons was actually highly successful, despite some major cultural anomalies happening. For those who are unfamiliar, throughout the 80s, something happened in the American society. We had something called the Satanic Panic, or the Moral Panic, where very concerned parents, wrongfully so, were convinced that certain media and games and other things that their kids were intaking were turning them into Satan worshippers and making them prone to violence. And so, due to this, Dungeons & Dragons was labeled as taboo, which only made the sales and want to play it increase. And so, they had an amazing decade in the 80s. Fun fact, due to the Satanic and Moral Panic of the 1980s, many studies were done on Dungeons & Dragons to see if it made children more prone to violence or more prone to social influence. And the studies done turned out so negative that they actually discovered that D&D is a great way for kids to learn problem-solving skills, gain a sense of community, and also uphold commitments that they commit to on a weekly basis. And so, anybody who still believes that D&D makes you Satan worshippers and prone to violence are not only wrong, they're stupid. But don't tell them that, we don't want them here. Unfortunately, due to the Satanic and Moral Panic of the 1980s, Dungeons & Dragons did feel the need to shift gears a little bit. And so, in 1989, they released the 2nd edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons while maintaining that basic set. And in that set, they omitted things like demons and devils, they removed certain imagery from the books, and they also removed certain aspects of the game that seemed too violent for kids, such as the Assassin class. Perhaps their shift of gear playing a major part in this. Throughout the 90s, parent company TSR struggled, and, on the verge of bankruptcy, were acquired by Wizards of the Coast. who owns Dungeons & Dragons to this day. After the acquisition in 1997, Wizards of the Coast immediately got on working on another edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and eventually in 2000, they took the basic set of Dungeons & Dragons and the advanced set of Dungeons & Dragons and merged them together, ending the two-pronged approach to create 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. In this new edition, they decided to expand the more options for role-playing and character customization, such as the addition of skills and feats through progression. But they weren't exactly happy with the final outcome with it. So, in 2003, they released an updated version of the 3rd edition, which many refer to as 3.5. This was the edition that I started playing with. 3.5 was a very beloved edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Seemingly taking into account all the things that the players wanted, 3.5 was highly successful. But, despite their success, Wizards of the Coast wanted more. And so, they began working on another edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and only 5 years later, in 2008, they released D&D 4th edition. In D&D 4th edition, they tried to streamline combat and make things easier for people to progress and get started in. And throughout it, at least to me, it really seems like they are trying to emulate the highly successful MMORPGs that were out on that time, like World of Warcraft and EverQuest. 4th edition was very poorly received by many people, for a myriad of reasons, some of which included their high concentration on combat, almost returning to their roots as a combat simulator, the very short time frame between the release of 3.5 and 4th edition, while so many people were very financially invested in 3.5, seeing as they released over 50 core rulebooks and 100 supplements for it within that 5 years. And also, the omission of core classes that people knew and loved from the initial player's handbook, such as Bard, Sorcerer, Druid, and Monk. Granted, they were added in later editions of the Player's Handbook that were released subsequently every year after that, but that didn't matter too much because a lot of people were not invested that much into it to look for those classes in those other books. And so, Wizards of the Coast kept moving. Fun fact, 3.5 was such a beloved system that once 4th edition was released, another company under the Open Gaming license released an entire system called Pathfinder. And Pathfinder in the 1st edition took the rule set from 3.5 and spun it off on its own thing so that it could prolong the life of 3.5. And it's still going on till this day, with the 2nd edition being released in 2018. It's also a game that I will probably be covering in a later video. As Wizards of the Coast learned from their mistakes from 4th edition, they decided to have more of player and user input in this time in the games rather than a closed discussion internally at the company. And so in 2012, they started playtesting material, and in 2014, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons was released. If you're watching this video now, most likely, this is the edition you've heard of. In 5th edition, they took a lot of aspects from 3.5 and spiced it up with some cool things they added in 4th edition, making it an easier experience for new and old players alike. Throughout the 2010s, they saw a huge burst in popularity in the latter half of it, with Stranger Things being released and they're playing Dungeons & Dragons in a basement, to streaming live play D&D online. Some of those groups that gained extreme popularity in that time were Critical Role, a bunch of voice actors playing Dungeons & Dragons, and Dimension 20, a bunch of comedians playing Dungeons & Dragons. And so throughout that popularity, they saw a huge year in 2017, an even bigger year in 2018, and an even bigger year in 2019 when it came to sales for Dungeons & Dragons. And in 2022, they announced that they were working on a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons. The new being in quotes. This edition, they promised to just unify Dungeons & Dragons under the one D&D title. It was going to be a backwards compatible version that you could still utilize 5th edition rules, just they were going to update them slightly. And 10 years after the initial release of 5th edition, on the 50th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons, Dungeons & Dragons 2024 was released. As I am recording this video, all 3 of the core rulebooks are out currently: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. And in this version, as far as I can tell, I haven't actually gotten my hands on those books yet. But they seem to have put more power in the player's hands and more diversity in the DM's hands. So you truly feel like the hero of your story, while the DM can truly throw some horrifying things at you. And that's basically it. That's the history of Dungeons & Dragons. I know, it was a lot. Let's take a deep breath together. There we go, short rest achieved. Let's move on to playing the game. Today we're going to talk about playing the most recent edition of Dungeons & Dragons, since that is the version that a majority of people know about currently. Now, Dungeons & Dragons is a D20 system,
What that means is the 20-sided dice is going to be your primary dice that you use for a majority of your rolls, such as your attack rolls, your ability checks, and your skill checks. Along with the d20, you also can utilize a d12, a d10, a d8, a d6, a d4, and a d100, which is just 2 d10s rolled at the same time. One determines the 10's value, and the other one determines the 1's value. To start off a game, you usually start with character creation. In character creation, you can choose from a myriad of different races and a few classes, with subclasses that you can personalize the character even more with. When it comes to races, you could be the basic things of a human, an elf, a dwarf, a halfling. You could also be a half-orc, a tiefling, somebody with fiend ancestry, a Aasimar, somebody with celestial ancestry, a Goliath, somebody with giant ancestry. Also, you could play as a myriad of different animal races, such as the turtle person, the tabaxi, the cat person, all the way to even a Harengon, the rabbit person. Then you generate your ability scores, and there are different ways that you can do this depending on your DM and your table, but your ability scores for this game are Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma. The best way I can explain the difference between those is called the tomato analogy. Now, in the tomato analogy, strength is how easily you can crush a tomato in your hands. Dexterity is your ability to throw a tomato at a tree and have it hit it, or if someone is thrown at you, being able to dodge it. Constitution is being able to hold down a bad tomato. Intelligence is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. And charisma is your ability to sell a tomato-based fruit salad. The tomato analogy. Your ability scores also determine your skills, each one being connected to a certain ability score. In addition, you gain proficiency in skills based off of your race, your class, and your background that you can choose. Now, when it comes to actually playing the game, what you're going to be doing in that campaign really depends on the table and the DM that you're working with. But there's usually a healthy balance between roleplay and combat. When it comes to roleplaying, you simply tell the DM what you'd like to do, and then the DM tells you what skill check is associated with that. Such as the example of, "Hey DM, can I go climb that tree over there?" And the DM will respond with, "Yeah, sure, give me an athletics check." Let's say you rolled a 10 on your athletics check, and you have a +2 to your athletics skill check. So you get a 12. The DM will then respond with, "Yeah, you climbed the tree. It's a little rough getting up there initially, but you get the hang of it and you eventually climb to the top of it." Now, when it comes to combat, it starts with your initiative to see who goes first and when. Initiative really depends on the table and the DM that you're working with. If you're noticing I'm saying that a lot, it's because D&D is extremely versatile and can truly be whatever you want it to. So when it comes to initiative, there are multiple ways that you can do it. I've seen ways where everybody goes individually. I personally do it so all the players go individually, and then certain enemies are grouped together if they're the like type of thing. But I've also seen it go as far as the enemies roll initiative, the good guys roll initiative, and whoever rolled higher depends on which group goes first, the good guys or the enemies, and you determine who wants to go win within that sphere. Every round of combat in Dungeons & Dragons is about 6 seconds long, which is real fun to imagine when you see all the things that are going on. When it comes to your turn, you have your movement, your action, and your bonus action, all of which you can do things with. When it's not your turn, you have a reaction that refreshes every time it's your turn, and certain classes and certain abilities give you things that you can do on your reaction. And combat usually ends when there's no more danger around, whether nobody else is left standing or you got the hell out of Dodge. It just depends. When it comes to progression, you can go up to level 20 in this game. When it comes to gaining levels, there's either XP or milestone. XP determines how much experience points you gain based off the creatures that you kill and the things that you do, and milestone is more based off of how much of the story did you do? How much of the story did you complete? Did you complete enough of the story to level up? When you level up, you can even choose to multi-class, where you take another level of a different class. If you're just starting out Dungeons & Dragons, I cannot emphasize this enough. Stick to one class. Do not homebrew. We'll get into homebrew in a second. Now we can jump into ways to play. If you're watching this and you want to DM, there are so many settings that you can throw your characters into. You could do high fantasy, such as the Forgotten Realms, the setting for the Dungeons & Dragons movies, and Baldur's Gate, or the original Greyhawk setting, the one that is published within the Dungeons Master's Guide of the 2024 version. You could do high magic and high technology, like Eberron, one of my personal favorite settings. You can even do a high magic space campaign in the setting called Spelljammer. Or, if none of those are suiting your fancy, you can always look online because there are multiple creators and so many different writers creating homebrew content under the Open Gaming license. Fun fact, Homebrewing has been around for as long as Dungeons & Dragons have been around, and homebrewing has been so essential to the game part that certain homebrew rules that were created early on with Dungeons & Dragons were actually integrated into the game itself. So anybody who says that utilizing homebrew is not the true way to play Dungeons & Dragons, ask them if they ever played a bard. If they did, they played as homebrew. Now that we've covered the history, how to play, and ways to play, it's time to talk about the why not. Why shouldn't you play Dungeons & Dragons? This is just to keep things fair, so you have all the facts at your disposal. Now, when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons, they've had 50 years to create some amazing things. And they have, but also, they've had 50 years to do some really bad things, which they have. A lot of those things have popped up in recent timelines, such as, back in 2022, they tried to revoke the Open Gaming License, in which case people could not create homebrew content and sell it, meaning that thousands of people would not only be out of work and out of revenue, they would most likely owe Wizards of the Coast, and in turn, Hasbro, so much money. Granted, the community didn't outcry against the change of the Open Gaming License, and they listened and decided that maybe we should have a little bit more input with our fans before we make big decisions like this. Also talking about that, in one of the recent releases of supplements for 5th edition, Spelljammer, they included a race called the Hodozi. The Hodozi's background had a very racially charged and racially insensitive additions to it that were an oversight by the people that made that edition. There was a public outcry. Wizards of the Coast eventually recalled the background, making it not canon for the Hodozi, and decided to work on it, and also made the promise that they would have multiple groups of a diverse cultural background review materials before it's put out, rather than just the project manager that was in charge of it. Of course, all the things that Dungeons & Dragons does and says that they're going to do should be taken with a grain of salt. Because, in all actuality, Dungeons & Dragons is no longer just owned by the small company TSR, but is instead owned by Wizards of the Coast. And Wizards of the Coast is owned by Hasbro. And Hasbro is one of the biggest board gaming companies, if not the biggest, in the entire world. A mega corporation, if you will. And so, the public perception is that Dungeons & Dragons cares about its community. But Hasbro, like any good corporation, cares about its shares, stocks, and profit. It all depends. But if that doesn't suit your fancy, just keep in mind that there are so many creative and immensely talented people creating supplements for Dungeons & Dragons that you can throw into your game. You can access the system online for free, learning the entire thing. But there are a lot of educational homebrew contents out there, like an entire book that was created by paleontologists to give you stat blocks for dinosaurs and more fun facts about them, all the way to something called Kinks and Cantrips, something that celebrates sex positivity and teaching you the safe way to practice kinks and fetishes. There is a myriad of different things you can do. So, I highly recommend that you give Dungeons & Dragons a shot after this. If you're looking to play Dungeons & Dragons, I would recommend going to your local friendly game store and seeing if there is an open table that you can jump in at. Or if you don't have a local friendly game store or don't like going outside, I get it, trust me, I would recommend looking online. There are Discord servers you can join. There's a website called startplaying.games where you can actually jump in on a table virtually. The options are endless. But if after all of this, you think, you know what, maybe Dungeons & Dragons isn't for me, then keep an eye on this channel because I'm going to be covering more systems that you have the option to play, because I truly believe that TTRPGs are for everybody. You just gotta find the right one. This was Dungeons & Dragons. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this, please like and subscribe and share it around, because I'd love to share this joy with everybody else and get people as educated as they can on the system that they're playing, or that the system that they could be playing. Leave a comment telling me which is your favorite species and class, or if you haven't played yet, which species and class do you think you'd like the most? Go ahead and check out the other videos on my channel. I've got so much more content, including tips for new DMs, tips for new players, and some other funny things that you can check out. Be on the lookout on my channel for more videos in the future, but until that time, I will catch you in the next one.